This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 149 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we are talking all about class and privilege when we travel, because it's a really interesting topic. It's something that I've thought about a lot, but I actually didn't think of putting together an episode about it until one of my guests suggested it, and he features later on in today's episode. So thank you very much to Chris for that suggestion. But yeah, class and privilege when we travel is something that often bothers me because, I was born here in Western Australia, very, middle class, very, very, privileged. I'm certainly not upper class or wealthy, but my parents managed to, make certain sacrifices so that we could travel. And of course, that taught me to love travel. I know, and I have long known, I live a very, very fortunate life. And obviously when we travel, we often see that in even deeper perspective if we travel to somewhere where, the average income is significantly less and things like that. Anyway, all of these things can be, very, very thought-provoking and sometimes difficult to navigate, and sometimes we feel guilty and all sorts of mixed emotions, basically. And so I'm very glad to bring you this episode where I've chatted with three people who've obviously also put a lot of thought into this and have some really interesting things to say. So I do not have any answers whatsoever, but I have a lot of questions. And today I have three people giving you some of their thoughts about these issues, which I hope will in turn help all of us to think more about it. So first up, I have Ella Loeffler, and you might remember recently I chatted with Ella while she has been volunteering in Malaysia, nearby. She's an ecologist and she's been doing some volunteer work with sea turtles in Malaysia. And so that current experience of hers had given her food for thought on this issue as well.
I think it's just something I think about a lot when I'm traveling.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, while I'm here, I'm in a area called Terengganu, which is a very Muslim part of Malaysia, and not a heap of white people, especially in the town we're near, which is called Dungan.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go in, I just get stared at and have been asked for photos and that kind of thing, which at first I found myself feeling a bit annoyed by, and then upon reflection, and a bit deeper thought, I started feeling uncomfortable in a different way, I think, which was sort of that sense of, I'm the white girl in a country that was colonized however many years ago, and there's obviously deeply rooted, political or cultural impacts of that, and I guess it just sparks a lot of thought for me. I don't know what the answer is, or there's obviously I'm not going to not come here just because I'm white, but I think it's very interesting that automatically I'm kind of seen in a way as someone exciting and maybe even in a weird way a bit superior, which I'm exceptionally uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
But obviously is not, it's not a bad, it's the local. That's how the locals view it, and that's okay. But I think I just find myself quite confused in that place of how to act, and I always try to be very friendly and, warm to people, but don't want to, I try very hard not to put off any sense of superiority or, not to embody my whiteness in that way.
Yeah. It's very tricky, isn't it? Because we did nothing to deserve this quote unquote superiority that sometimes is thrust upon us.
And but I'm also very wary of not getting annoyed at it and being like, oh, like, why are they annoying me? I'm white. Because I'm white, skin color shouldn't be anything. But obviously that's not the case. There's a historical reality and things behind it that are in play.
Yeah.
And I can't just come here and expect certain things.
And you don't want to give white tourists or white volunteers or anyone a bad reputation either by expressing any annoyance. So.
Yeah, no. And I think beyond that sort of initial maybe confusion. I definitely don't find it annoying anymore. I find it more than anything maybe a little bit sad that but yeah, also, I'm not sure how well developed those thoughts are, and I'm always thinking a lot about it when I travel. And I think also, obviously, actual class privilege comes into that, because I am much more privileged than most of the local people. And the reality is that I can afford to just come to their country and, spend $100 on scuba diving and then go out for dinner and, and whatever. Whereas for them, that's a lot of money. And, there is obviously going to be that distinction there when I'm coming from a privileged place such as Australia.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I feel the same. After many, many, many years of travel, I'm still confused by it. I still don't know what to do about it. And it still bothers me, and it makes me really uncomfortable to feel that I have this, accidental privilege, and I still don't know what to do about it.
Accidental privilege, yeah. But, it still is privilege, and it's something that I try to be aware of and never take advantage of while I'm traveling, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's almost the most that we can do, in a sense, and just be really aware of it and how we can act around it. But it's very unfair that we have this privilege.
But I think also probably that's why I prefer to go traveling to one place for a longer period of time, just because it also gives me a chance to understand a place better and, potentially build more genuine relationships with local people, and not just feel like I'm sort of coming and going and floating through somewhere.
Yes.
Which can also be really nice. There's also nice things.
There's a time and a place for it, but I agree with you. I do prefer that slower travel and basing yourself somewhere for a longer time. And I think it gives you the opportunity for, those reciprocal relationships where it goes much beyond that initial, kind of discomfort of class and privilege and stuff, and you actually get to know each other as just normal humans who have, a lot in common, actually.
Yeah. So, I think that's always a good thing to...
Lots of thoughtful thoughts from Ella there, and it pleases me to kind of think about the fact that slow travel has yet another advantage, is in that getting to know people better and dealing with them on a daily basis for a long time can help break down some of these kind of privilege and class issues, and we get to know people better. Just another bonus of slow travel, because I'm a big fan of it. Now, today my next guest is Nate Hake from Travel Lemming. It's his first appearance on the Thoughtful Travel podcast, so welcome, Nate. Now, Nate has thought about the issue of privilege a lot in different ways, and it was really interesting to speak to him because he'd obviously considered this in over the years in many interesting in many interesting ways. And I'll link to a blog post of his in particular that I found really, really useful.
I struggle a lot, I think, when it comes to thinking about class and travel, because it's such a multifaceted subject. You have, for one thing, I always tell people, and I've written about this on my blog, that I feel like it's very much the case that travel is a privilege, and we bloggers will spend a lot of time encouraging people to travel and saying, oh, you can travel, you definitely can travel. Travel is cheaper than you think. You can save up travel, because there is this perception out there, particularly in Western countries, that travel is necessarily expensive, because so many people are used to traveling on this sort of vacation mindset where money just falls off of you. But if in fact you're willing to become a budget traveler, you can do it quite affordably. With that said, it's still definitely a privilege in a number of different ways. One is that if you're not somebody who comes from a Western country, and even if you are and aren't from an economic class where you have the kind of resources to be able to do it, it can still be inaccessible. It's also something, there's passport privilege, right? Mm-hmm. Which I often meet when I get messages all the time from, because I have some content about a few of the very few countries that Indian travelers are able to go to visa free, and they're always asking me for other places they can go visa free, and the list is really small. Bolivia is one of them, but there's like 7 or 8 places that I would recommend people going that are on that list, and just most of the world's completely excluded them. And I have an American passport, and with that you can go just about anywhere.
Yeah.
And and even if you have to get a visa, it's usually not that big of a pain in the butt. And when I do get a visa, I complain, when I have to go through a visa process, I complain so much about it, about how hard it was. Like when I went to Nigeria, it really was, I went for my friend's wedding, and it really was quite difficult to get the visa to go there. And because I was away and I was living in Thailand at the time, they require you to get it from your home embassy in the US. And I was like, I'm not going to fly to DC just to get a visa to go to Nigeria and then wait 2 weeks for them to process the visa and go back to DC. And so I ended up sorting it out. But, my friend who was Nigerian told me, he was like, that is basically our experience when it comes to traveling anywhere.
Exactly.
And that's, that's definitely true. And another thing that I've written about, which I think is something people forget about, is the privilege of being a native English speaker, which is that it's really funny. I'm in Ukraine right now, where I've been living for the last year, and I don't speak hardly any Russian, no Ukrainian. And I'll just go to the restaurant and you just speak in English because that's the expectation that there's going to be someone who will figure it out. And they always do. And that's the case in most places. I also speak Spanish, so I'm from a Spanish speaking country. I'll speak that. But otherwise, you just lead with the English. And it's you're in somebody else's country, and yet you're kind of expecting them to speak your language, which is a little bit, I call it a bit of linguistic imperialism still. And also, when you think about travelers from other countries, if you're a traveler from Vietnam and you're wanting to travel Europe, you're probably going to have to be speaking in English, which is not your native language. And then if you're speaking to somebody else who's not a native language speaker, it's all the more difficult because you have two non-native speakers trying to understand each other through this sort of common tongue. And so being born speaking English is a huge privilege, I think, that in addition to sort of, and it happens to overlap with these economic privileges, right?
Yeah,
like the folks who speak English also happen to tend to be wealthier. So
and have a good passport.
And they have a good passport, right? So like all of these privileges really come together to a place where it can become easy, I think, for a lot of folks to forget that these really are pretty significant privileges. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I know. I remember a few years back when I started to realize just how lucky I was. I used to complain about my Australian passport, and I lived in Eastern Europe for a while, and it was back in the early 2000s when we actually still needed to get visas for a lot of Eastern European countries. And I used to complain about that all the time until I realized that, I had to get a visa, but then I could still go. And it was really a pretty straightforward matter to get it. And like you said, there's plenty of people who can barely go anywhere without a really arduous visa process and, interviews and rejections. And, we didn't do anything to deserve this good passport. It's just the luck of the draw of where we were born. So it's such a privilege. And I think you're right. It's so important that we remember that. So much food for thought there. And I'm well aware that I have economic privilege, that I have the privilege of being born a native English speaker. There's a downside of that, though, because it means I think we're less likely to learn other languages. But, in terms of traveling, it's not a very big downside, perhaps. And I do try and learn other languages. But anyway, so that privilege, passport privilege, I mean, really, I've won the lottery, haven't I? And it's not something I take for granted. At least I try very hard not to. So as I mentioned, I'll include a link to one of Nate's blog posts, which discusses this in more detail. Now, my final guest today is Chris Haag, who actually had the idea for this episode in the first place, and I'm grateful for that because I've been finding it really fascinating to discuss these topics. Now, I recorded a chat with Chris while he was in Mexico, and our internet connection was not brilliant, so you'll find that the sound breaks up and cuts out just a little bit, but I think you will easily still get the message, and it's not too bad. So I asked Chris to tell me what he thought about class distinctions and privilege issues.
So I've been in Mexico now for 4 months, and I was just talking to somebody about it this morning in Spanish, which made it all the more difficult for me. And I guess what's strange to me is that in Mexico, at first glance, it is shockingly more like the United States than you ever expect, I guess. At least for me. I mean, in the United States, we kind of have this narrative of Mexico being this poor, downtrodden country. and then you get here and you they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're insurance salesmen, they're, mechanics, and on so many levels, surface, it just seems so much more like America than I expected. And then you kind of start to dig below the surface, and you start to see that, it is a lot poorer than the United States. And in a lot of ways, people kind of improvise their way through the world financially in a lot of situations. And I guess for me, it's difficult to comprehend most times. It's like you see it and it's different, but you don't really understand what's going on. And a lot of times I guess I try to talk to people about it, and you sort of feel like this rich jerk because you're trying to talk to somebody about like your financial situation versus their financial situation, or the economic situation of your country versus theirs, and it's so different that at some point in the conversation there's always this strange realization that it's like, wow, from their end, it's like they look at you like, wow, you're really wealthy. And from my end, I kind of look at the situation. I'm like, wow, like this place is really poor compared to where I come from. And you don't feel rich, right?
No, exactly. Yeah.
In your own life.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think like I'm a middle class American. I'm doing okay, but I'm not,
you're no billionaire.
I'm not ordering caviar and buying champagne.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's all relative.
Right. Yeah.
How do you reconcile those feelings, when you're talking, especially when you're traveling and meeting locals and, making friends with local people? I know I've felt very uncomfortable sometimes in those situations. What's it like for you?
I feel uncomfortable too. And honestly, I don't know what to think of it, because it's so different. Like poverty here is different than in the US. It's like you can be talking to somebody here that is in so many ways so like you, and in so many ways so kind of what's the word, maybe cosmopolitan. And it's kind of just it just messes with your head. I don't know. I never know. I always leave those conversations a little bit confused about what just happened.
Yes.
Or who I spoke to.
Yeah, I have the same feeling, and I do feel confused by it. And I think a lot of it is, as you said earlier, you don't feel rich or different. You feel, average, I suppose, is the right, possibly the right word for it. And I certainly feel like an average citizen. But when those, like class distinctions are so far apart, I suppose, well, at least the financial distinction is far apart. It's just, I feel guilty, but there's no point in feeling guilty. So what do? I don't know. Yeah.
And ultimately, I mean, there's nothing you can do. I don't want to say there's nothing you can do, but in the grand scheme of things, there's very little that I can do. And I think that somehow learning about it, hopefully that makes me more mindful of it. And I don't know, I don't know how that translates into, something that I can change about myself that makes these things better. I mean, I'd love to say that I can, that'll somehow I'll learn about it and maybe I can alleviate poverty in some way. But that's a pretty big problem that we've been working on for a long time.
That's
with very
right.
progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there might be small things we can do, but it's those tricky conversations, I think. Maybe they're only tricky from our end. I don't know.
No, I think it's tricky from both ends. Like even strange situations here, like going out to dinner with somebody that has a job here that in the States would pay very well.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of fall into this mindset that, oh, this person is a doctor or whatever it is that they do. And so you assume, this person's at a certain level economically. And then the tab comes and maybe I bought dinner the other night when we went out. And now this night, it's sort of like, traditionally they kind of feel like, well, Chris bought dinner the other night. Now I have to buy dinner. And sometimes you can kind of see, they go to grab that check and it's in the price might be something that for you, it's like, oh,
it's fine.
Whatever. It's $35, right? Okay. And then for them, you can kind of see them grab that check and it's like, ooh, this is like, that's a big meal.
Yeah. Oh, it's awkward, isn't it?
And I don't know what to do in those situations because part of me wants to like grab the check and be like, dude,
I got it.
No problem.
Yeah.
I got it. Yeah. But then at the same time, like, is that...
So again, lots of really good food for thought there from Chris. His last story about going out for dinner with someone actually reminded me of probably the only time in my life when my travels have led me to the reverse situation of this class privilege. When I lived in Japan, I had a student who was a dentist from a very wealthy family of dentists. Every single member of the family seemed to be a dentist and they were particularly well off. And she often would invite me places, and it was one of those situations where, it would be impossible on my English teaching salary to really ever pay for those meals. And gosh, it was hard because, it really reminded me what it would feel like to be in that position more often. Because, I would look at the bill and think, there's no way I could ever pay for this. And so I would try to pay in other situations when we were together, instead of those. But yeah, it's a horrible, awkward situation for everyone, really. But I have no solutions. As I said in the beginning, I just have thoughts. So I hope that this episode has given you some food for thought. And I would love to hear more of what you think about the whole idea of class and privilege when we travel. Best place to have this discussion, I think, is in our Facebook group. So hop on over to the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. There's a link in the show notes if you haven't yet joined, or just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook. The show notes for this episode are at notaballerina.com/149. And thank you very much to my great guests who all gave such insightful tales and discussion for this topic. First up, we chatted with Ella Loeffler, and she would encourage you to look at the Sea Turtle Nest program where she's been volunteering. You can adopt a sea turtle. They're doing awesome work there. She's been at Langtenga. So if you go to langtengaturtlewatch.org/adoptions, you can help out that program. Next up, I chatted with Nate from Travel Lemming. So if you can find him at travellemming.com, and I'll leave a link in the show notes to his blog post about the privilege of being an English speaker, the linguistic privilege, he calls it, which is so true. And last but definitely not least, because I'm grateful to Chris for starting this whole topic off, you can find Chris at theplacesip.com. Those places are many because he is on a huge bicycle odyssey through the Americas. Last but not least, a quick apology if you can hear too much noise in the background on my end. It is garden rubbish pickup season here. So it means that I've been trying to find a spot to record this episode, or a time slot where there are not people cutting their garden back, but it seems impossible at the moment. So I can hear some tree trimming going on in the background, but I hope you can't. Anyway, thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.